A widowed mother and her 11 children, cast out like animals into the wilderness. No food, no shelter, no mercy from the town that once called itself Christian. As darkness swallowed the prairie and the youngest child's cries grew weaker, Eliza Moore made a choice that would change everything. She led her family toward a barn on the edge of nowhere, knowing the owner might shoot them on sight or save them from the cold. What happened next would test everything she thought she knew about survival, trust, and what it means to truly belong somewhere. Stay with me until the very end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rocks came first. Not words, not warnings, just stones, hurled by hands Eliza Moore had once clasped in friendship, crashing against the walls of the shanty she'd called home for 3 desperate months. The children screamed inside, the younger ones anyway. The older ones had learned to go silent when violence arrived. Out! Out with you, woman! You and your cursed brood! Eliza pressed her back against the door, her thin frame barely enough to keep it shut as fists pounded from the other side. Through the gaps in the weathered wood, she could see them. Mr. Hutchins from the mercantile, his face twisted with righteous anger. Mrs. Pettigrew, whose pies Eliza had once praised at church socials, now spitting fury. Even young Thomas Green, just 17, his eyes hard as flint, a shovel raised like a weapon. Mama? 7-year-old Sarah tugged at her skirt, her voice small and cracking. Mama, why are they so angry? Eliza couldn't answer. Her throat had closed around words that would only frighten the children more. Behind her, in the dim single room that had sheltered all 13 of them, she heard baby William whimpering, heard 13-year-old Rebecca trying to shush him, heard the older boys, Matthew and John, moving toward the door, their young shoulders already braced for a fight they couldn't possibly win. No. Eliza's voice came out hoarse but firm. Matthew, John, stay back. All of you, stay back. The pounding intensified. The door shuddered under the assault. We gave you charity, Mr. Hutchins roared. Gave you work. Gave you a roof. And how do you repay us? By bringing pestilence. By cursing this town. Pestilence. The word cut through Eliza like a blade. 3 children in town had fallen ill with fever. 3 children who'd played with her youngest in the street just days before. And now, though not a single one of her own children showed even a sniffle, the town had decided. The widow Moore and her overwhelming brood were the cause. They were the rot. They were the curse that needed cutting out. We haven't done anything, Eliza shouted back, her voice breaking. My children are healthy. Please, we'll leave if we must, but give us until morning. Please, the little ones. You'll leave now! The door splintered. Eliza stumbled backward as it burst inward, and suddenly the room was full of angry faces and grabbing hands. Someone seized her arm. Someone else began dragging the children toward the opening, their small bodies tumbling over each other in terror. Don't touch them! Eliza lunged forward, her worn boots slipping on the dirt floor, but Mr. Hutchins caught her by the shoulder and shoved her hard against the wall. Her head cracked against wood. Stars exploded behind her eyes. Mama! Matthew, at 15, was the oldest. Tall but gangly, all elbows and fury, he threw himself at Mr. Hutchins, his fists flying with more courage than skill. The older man caught him easily, twisting the boy's arm until Matthew cried out. You want to be a man? Hutchins snarled into the boy's face. Then act like one. Get your family out of our town before I drag you all out by the hair. He released Matthew with a violent shove. The boy crashed into Eliza, and she caught him, held him, felt his whole body shaking with rage and helplessness. Get your things, she whispered against his ear. Quickly now, just what we can carry. They had almost nothing anyway. In less than 10 minutes, the Moore family stood in the street, if you could call the muddy path between buildings a street. Eliza held baby William against her chest, his small fist clutching the fabric of her dress. The other children clustered around her like frightened birds. Rebecca, Matthew, John, Sarah, the twins Daniel and David, 9-year-old Ruth, 6-year-old Thomas Jr., 4-year-old Mary, and 3-year-old Joseph. 11 children, ages ranging from 15 years to 8 months. Their eyes wide and confused, their clothes patched and repatched, their stomachs already hollow from too many meals stretched too thin. They carried 1 blanket, 1 cooking pot, a sack with perhaps 3 pounds of cornmeal. That was all Mr. Hutchins had allowed them to take. "And don't come back," Mrs. Pettigrew called from her doorway, her arms crossed over her ample chest. "We've got enough troubles without feeding every widow and her litter that wanders through." Other townspeople had gathered now, watching from windows and porches. No one spoke in Eliza's defense. No one offered even a word of sympathy. These were the same people who had smiled at her husband's funeral 8 months ago, who had promised to remember her in their prayers, who had said the words that people always said, "If you need anything, anything at all." They had needed everything, and received nothing but contempt. Eliza adjusted William on her hip and reached for little Joseph's hand. "Come along, children," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "We're going now." Going where? Rebecca's question was barely a whisper, but it struck Eliza like a physical blow. Going where? Going where? Going where? She didn't know. "Away from here," she said simply. "Somewhere better." It was a lie, and Rebecca, sharp-eyed, sharp-minded Rebecca, who'd already had to grow up too fast, probably knew it. But the girls said nothing, just took Mary's hand on one side and Ruth's on the other, forming a chain that connected the family in a fragile line. They walked out of town as the sun climbed toward noon, the autumn heat pressing down on their heads without mercy. Behind them, doors closed, curtains fell back into place. The town called Redemption, oh, the bitter irony of that name, returned to its business as if the moors had never existed at all. The prairie stretched out in every direction, an endless ocean of yellow grass beneath a pale, indifferent sky. No trees offered shade. No buildings broke the monotony of earth and horizon. Just emptiness and the dirt road that led away from Redemption toward, what? Another town that would take them in for a few weeks before deciding they were too much trouble? Another barn where they'd sleep until the owner chased them off? Another night of the children crying themselves to sleep with hunger? They walked for hours. The baby grew heavy in Eliza's arms, and her shoulders ached with a pain that went bone deep. Little Joseph began to limp, then to whimper, and finally Rebecca picked him up and carried him, though she was only 13 and slight as a reed. Matthew took the cooking pot from Sarah. John shouldered the blanket. Even the smallest children who could walk tried not to complain, their lips pressed tight against words that might burden their mother further. By mid-afternoon, the sun had turned vicious. Heat rose from the earth in shimmering waves. Sweat soaked through Eliza's dress, plastering it to her back. Her throat felt like sandpaper. The children's faces had gone red, then pale. Little Mary stumbled and fell, and when Ruth tried to help her up, both girls just sat down in the dirt together, too exhausted to rise. "We need water," Matthew said, his voice cracking on the words. "Mama, they need water." Eliza looked around desperately. Nothing. No stream, no well, no sign of civilization in any direction. The road they'd been following had dwindled to barely a track, 2 faint ruts in the grass that might have been made by a wagon months or years ago. "Just a little further," she heard herself saying. "Just a little further, and we'll rest." But how much further? And rest where? The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness. The children walked, then shuffled, then stumbled. The twins began to cry, their small voices rising in unison, a sound that clawed at Eliza's heart with sharp fingers. She wanted to comfort them, wanted to promise them everything would be fine, wanted to be the mother they deserved, strong, capable, certain. Instead, she was just a woman walking into nothing, leading her children toward a horizon that never came closer. When the sun finally began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Eliza had any space left in her soul for beauty, she saw it, a dark shape in the distance, breaking the flat line of the prairie. "There," she said, pointing with the hand that wasn't supporting the baby. "Look, children, a building." Hope flickered in their tired eyes, fragile, desperate hope that Eliza herself hardly dared to feel. But they pressed forward with renewed effort, their feet moving faster despite the blisters that must be forming, the exhaustion that weighted every limb. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into a barn, large, weathered, standing alone like a monument to isolation. Behind it, barely visible in the failing light, stood a small house, more of a cabin, really, rough-built but solid. No light showed in the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. "Is anyone home?" Sarah asked. "I don't know, sweetheart." They approached slowly, their small parade of ragged refugees drawing nearer to the structure that represented their only hope of shelter for the night. Eliza's mind raced through possibilities and consequences. If someone lived here, would they be kind or cruel? Would they help or hurt? Would they open their door or raise a gun? And if no one lived here, if this place was abandoned, was that better or worse? Shelter without permission was theft, but the children needed shelter. Needed it desperately. The barn loomed larger as they approached, and Eliza could see now that it was well maintained despite its weathered appearance. The doors were solid, the roof intact. Someone cared for this place, which meant someone would likely return to it. She stopped at the barn doors, the children clustering around her legs like chicks around a hen. The baby had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his breath warm on her neck. The others watched her with wide eyes, waiting for her decision, trusting her to know what to do. Trusting her when she had no idea at all. "Matthew," she said quietly, "help me with the door." Together they pulled it open, the hinges creaking in the silence. The smell of hay and animals wafted out. Horses, she thought, though she saw none in the dim interior. The barn was clean, organized, with stalls along one side and a ladder leading up to a hayloft. "Inside," Eliza said. "Quietly now." They filed in like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The barn was still warm from the day's heat, but it felt like heaven compared to the exposed prairie. Eliza guided them to the far corner away from the doors, where hay had been stacked in neat piles. "Spread the blanket here," she told Rebecca. "Make a place for the little ones to sleep." While Rebecca worked, Eliza finally allowed herself to lower the baby into the hay. Her arms trembled with relief as William's weight left them. She rolled her shoulders, trying to work out the knots, and looked at her children in the dying light that filtered through gaps in the barn walls. They were filthy, exhausted, terrified, but alive. "I know you're hungry," she said softly, crouching down so she could meet their eyes. "I know you're tired, but we're safe here, at least for tonight. We'll sleep, and in the morning, we'll figure out what comes next." "What if the owner comes?" John asked. At 13, he was already pragmatic, already thinking ahead to consequences. "Then I'll talk to him," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. "I'll explain our situation. Most people have some kindness in them." Even as she said it, she thought of the stones thrown in redemption, the faces twisted with disgust, the absolute certainty in their voices when they'd called her children cursed. "Mama?" It was Ruth, her voice small in the shadows. "Are we really cursed?" The question pierced Eliza's heart. She reached out and pulled Ruth close, then gathered as many of the children as she could reach into her arms. "No," she said firmly. "No, my darlings, you are not cursed. You are blessings, every single one of you. Don't you ever believe differently." "Then why—" "Because people are afraid," Eliza interrupted gently. "When they're afraid, they need someone to blame. And we were convenient." It was the simplest truth she could offer, and perhaps the only one that mattered. The children seemed to accept it, or at least they were too tired to question further. Rebecca had spread the blanket, and now she began arranging the younger children on it, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. The twins curled together, Mary with her head on Ruth's shoulder, little Joseph already half asleep. Eliza nursed the baby one more time, her own stomach cramping with hunger that she tried to ignore. There would be no food tonight. The cornmeal they'd brought would have to last, and she had no way to cook it anyway without fire or water. Tomorrow. Everything would have to wait until tomorrow. "Matthew, John," she said quietly, "you boys sleep near the door. If anyone comes—" "We'll wake you," Matthew finished. His young face looked harder than it should, aged by circumstances he never should have faced. "Don't worry, Mama." But she did worry. How could she not? These were her children, her responsibility, her precious ones. Their father had died in a logging accident, crushed beneath a tree that fell wrong, leaving Eliza with a grief so vast she sometimes felt she might drown in it. But worse than the grief was the practical reality. 11 children to feed, clothe, and shelter with no income, no land, no male protector in a world that valued such things above all else. She'd tried. In the months since Thomas's death, she'd tried everything. Took in washing until her hands cracked and bled. Cleaned houses until her back screamed. Begged for credit at the mercantile until Mr. Hutchins' face turned to stone at the sight of her. Sold everything she owned, her wedding ring, her mother's locket, Thomas's tools, until there was nothing left to sell. And still, it hadn't been enough. Could never be enough. 11 mouths were simply too many for one woman's labor to feed. The town's patience had lasted longer than she'd expected, actually. 3 months of grudging charity before the fever had given them an excuse to cast her out. 3 months before they decided that their limited compassion was better spent elsewhere, on more deserving poor. The kind who came in smaller numbers and brought less inconvenience. Now, sitting in a stranger's barn with her children sleeping around her in the hay, Eliza felt the full weight of her failure pressing down on her chest. She had not protected them, had not provided for them, had not kept them safe from the cruelty of the world. Outside, night had fallen completely. Through the gaps in the barn walls, she could see stars beginning to emerge. Thousands of them, cold and distant and indifferent to the suffering of one widow and her children. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Every prayer she'd uttered since Thomas's death had gone unanswered, and she was tired, so desperately tired, of speaking into silence. The baby stirred against her, and she shifted him gently, settling into the hay beside the other children. The barn was quiet except for their breathing, 11 different rhythms, from Matthew's slow and steady to the baby's quick and light. Her children, her world, everything that mattered. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about tomorrow. The sound that woke her wasn't loud, just the soft creak of the barn door opening. But Eliza's eyes flew open instantly, her body tensing with an animal alertness born of too many nights sleeping in unsafe places. Moonlight spilled through the widening door, silhouetting a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, male. Eliza's hand moved instinctively to cover the baby's mouth, ready to muffle any cry. Beside her, she felt Matthew stirring, felt his body coiling to spring. She put her other hand on his shoulder, holding him still, holding him silent. The figure stepped into the barn, and she heard the soft clink of something metal. A bucket? He moved with the quiet confidence of someone in familiar territory, walking toward the stalls on the far side of the barn. He hadn't seen them yet, hidden as they were in the shadows of the far corner. Eliza's mind raced. Should she speak? Remain silent and hope he didn't notice them? Try to slip out with the children while his back was turned? Before she could decide, the man hung his bucket on a hook and lit a lantern. Warm light flooded the barn, and Eliza knew immediately that their hiding place was no longer hidden at all. The man turned, and his eyes found them instantly. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The man stood frozen, his hand still on the lantern, his eyes wide with obvious surprise. He was younger than Eliza expected, maybe 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were simple: work pants, a shirt that had seen better days, boots worn but well-maintained. His gaze moved from Eliza to the children, counting them. She could see him counting, see the disbelief growing in his expression as the number climbed. 11. 11 children in his barn, uninvited and unexpected. Eliza stood slowly, carefully, trying not to wake the younger ones. She stepped forward, placing herself between the man and her sleeping children, her chin lifting even as her hands trembled. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't make us leave tonight. Just let us stay until morning. The children, they can't walk anymore. They need sleep. I promise we'll go at first light. Please." The man's expression was unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment, and Eliza braced herself for anger, for the order to get out, for the violence she'd learned to expect from a world that had no patience for desperate women with too many children. Instead, he spoke just one word. "Stay." Eliza blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Stay," he repeated, his voice rough but not unkind. "Let them sleep." He turned away before she could respond, taking the lantern with him toward the stalls. Eliza stood rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. No interrogation, no accusations, no demand for explanation or payment. Just stay? She watched as he moved through his evening routine, checking on the horses she now saw in the stalls, refreshing their water, his movements efficient and sure. He didn't look at her again, didn't acknowledge the enormous intrusion of 13 people in his private space. He simply worked, as if finding a widow and 11 children sleeping in his barn was the most ordinary thing in the world. Finally, he finished his tasks, extinguished the lantern except for one that he left hanging near the door, and walked toward the exit. He paused there, his hand on the doorframe, and looked back at Eliza one more time. "There's a pump outside," he said quietly. "Left side of the barn. Help yourself to water." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Eliza standing in the dim light with tears streaming down her face, tears of relief so overwhelming she had to press her hand to her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. "Let them sleep," he'd said. Such simple words, such ordinary kindness, and yet they felt like the first mercy she'd received since the world had turned cold and cruel. Eliza sank back down into the hay beside her children, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and gratitude and fear that this unexpected gentleness might evaporate like a dream. She pulled the baby close, felt Rebecca shift toward her in sleep, and let herself cry silently in the darkness. Outside, the prairie night pressed close around the lonely barn, but inside, for the first time in months, Eliza felt something that terrified her almost as much as despair. Hope. Morning came with golden light slanting through the gaps in the barn walls, painting stripes across the hay where the children still slept. Eliza had been awake for hours, watching the darkness fade, her body tense with anticipation of what the day would bring. The stranger's kindness last night had been real. She hadn't dreamed it, but daylight had a way of changing things. People often regretted their generosity once they saw clearly what they'd agreed to shelter. She rose carefully, stepping over sleeping children, and made her way to the barn door. Opening it just enough to slip through, she found herself facing a morning so beautiful it hurt. The prairie stretched out in every direction, the grass moving in waves beneath a breeze that carried the scent of earth and distance. The sky was enormous, pale blue and cloudless, and for a moment Eliza allowed herself to simply stand there, breathing air that didn't smell of fear or failure. The pump stood where the man had said it would be, a simple hand pump with a wooden trough beneath it. Eliza worked the handle, and after a few resistant squeaks, water gushed out, clear and cold and more precious than gold. She cupped her hands beneath the flow and drank deeply, the water soothing her parched throat, then splashed her face, washing away the grime of yesterday's desperate journey. When she straightened, wiping water from her eyes, she saw him. The man stood perhaps 30 yards away, near a small corral attached to the barn. He was brushing down a horse, his movements rhythmic and patient, and he'd clearly been there for some time. He must have seen her emerge from the barn, must have watched her drink, but he gave no sign of it. Just kept working, his attention seemingly absorbed by the animal before him. Eliza's first instinct was to approach him, to thank him, to explain, to beg for further mercy. But something held her back. Perhaps the quality of his stillness, the sense that this was a man who valued space and silence. Instead, she returned to the barn, where the children were beginning to stir. "Mama?" Sarah's voice came sleepy and confused. "Where are we?" "Somewhere safe," Eliza said softly, kneeling beside her daughter. "Come, sweetheart, let's get you and the others some water." One by one, she roused them gently, led them outside in small groups to drink from the pump and tend to their basic needs. The older children helped the younger ones, Rebecca taking charge of the twins while Matthew guided little Joseph, everyone moving quietly as if they sensed that their continued welcome depended on not being too much trouble. The man continued his work with the horses, never approaching, never speaking. But Eliza felt his awareness of them like a physical presence, not threatening exactly, but watchful, assessing. By the time all the children had drunk their fill and returned to the barn, the sun had climbed higher and Eliza's stomach was cramping with hunger. The baby fussed against her shoulder, and she knew he could feel her own body's emptiness. Her milk would dry up if she didn't eat soon, and then what would William do? She was trying to calculate whether she could make the cornmeal into something edible without fire or proper water when she heard footsteps approaching the barn. Her body went rigid, and she saw Matthew and John both tense, moving protectively toward their younger siblings. The man appeared in the doorway, and in the full light of morning, Eliza could see him more clearly. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his features too rough, but there was something solid about him, something steady. His eyes, she noticed, were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds over water. He carried a canvas bag in one hand and a covered pot in the other. He set both down just inside the door, then stepped back, as if approaching wild animals that might bolt. "There's grain in the sack," he said, his voice as rough as she remembered. "And some stew from last night. Still good." Eliza stared at him, her throat closing around words that wouldn't form. The children watched with wide eyes, their hunger evident in the way they looked at the pot, but not one of them moved toward it. Eliza managed finally. "We can't accept." "Already cooked," he interrupted, his tone practical. "Would just go to waste." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Name's Ethan Cole. This is my land." "Eliza Moore," she replied, her voice steadier now. "These are my children." His gaze swept over them again, that same counting look from last night, but this time Eliza thought she saw something else in his expression, not judgment or disgust, but something almost like recognition. Like he understood, somehow, what it meant to be this desperate. "Mrs. Moore," he said with a slight nod. Then he was gone, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth outside. The moment he disappeared, the children surged forward. Rebecca reached the pot first, lifting the lid to reveal a thick beef stew, the smell of it so overwhelming that little Mary actually whimpered. Eliza's hand shook as she helped portion it out, using the tin cup they'd brought from Redemption, making sure each child got some before she allowed herself even a taste. It was simple fare: beef, potatoes, carrots, all cooked until soft. But it tasted like salvation. The children ate silently, reverently, scraping every drop from the pot until it shone clean. The grain in the sack turned out to be oats and cornmeal, more than they'd seen in months, and Eliza felt tears prick her eyes again at this stranger's incomprehensible generosity. "Mama," Rebecca said quietly, once everyone had eaten, "how long can we stay?" It was the question Eliza had been avoiding, the one that sat like a stone in her chest. "I don't know, sweetheart. He said we could stay last night, and he's given us food, but we can't take advantage of his kindness." "What will we do?" John asked, and there was something in his voice, a weariness that no 13-year-old should possess, that broke Eliza's heart. "We'll ask him," she decided. "I'll speak to Mr. Cole and find out what he expects from us. Perhaps he needs help with something. Perhaps there's work we can do in exchange for shelter, at least until we can figure out where to go next." But even as she said it, Eliza couldn't imagine where that next place might be. Every town seemed the same, willing to offer temporary charity, then eager to be rid of the burden when it became inconvenient. And her family was nothing if not inconvenient. She spent the rest of the morning organizing their meager possessions and trying to make the corner of the barn they occupied look less like an invasion and more like a temporary, tidy arrangement. The children helped, even the little ones, straightening hay and folding the blanket, their movements quiet and careful. Around midday, Eliza ventured outside again, looking for Ethan Cole. She found him behind the small house, chopping wood with steady, powerful strokes. His shirt was dark with sweat, and a pile of split logs grew beside him with each swing of the axe. She approached slowly, waiting until he paused to wipe his brow before speaking. "Mr. Cole?" He turned, his expression neutral. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar that ran along his jawline, the calluses on his hands that spoke of years of hard labor. "I wanted to thank you," Eliza said, forcing herself to meet his eyes, "for the food, for letting us stay. You didn't have to do any of that." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Had food. You needed it." "Still," she persisted, "it was kind, more than kind." He didn't respond, just reached for another log and positioned it on the chopping block. Eliza realized he wasn't trying to be rude. He simply didn't know what to do with her thanks, didn't know how to receive gratitude for what he clearly considered a simple, practical action. She tried a different approach. "Mr. Cole, I need to know your expectations." We're grateful for your shelter, but we can't stay indefinitely without contributing something. If there's work that needs doing, laundry, cooking, mending, anything, my children and I are willing. The older ones are strong workers, and even the younger ones can help with— No need, he interrupted, his axe coming down with a sharp crack that split the log clean through. Eliza felt frustration rising in her chest. Mr. Cole, please, we can't accept charity without— Not charity. He set up another log, his movements deliberate. You're here. You need shelter. I've got shelter. That's all. But we have 11 children, Eliza said, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. 11. That's not a small imposition, that's— I can count, Mrs. Moore. The sharpness in his tone stopped her. He swung the axe again, harder this time, and the log exploded into pieces. Then he set the axe down carefully and turned to face her fully. I know what I'm seeing, he said quietly. I know what you're carrying, and I'm telling you, stay. No payment needed, no work required. Just let your children rest. Something in his voice made Eliza's breath catch. There was a weight to his words, a depth of understanding that went beyond simple kindness. This was a man who knew what it meant to need shelter, to need mercy. She didn't know his story, but she recognized the shadow of it in his eyes. How long? She asked softly. He picked up the axe again, tested its weight in his hands. Long as you need. Then he returned to his work, the conversation clearly over. Eliza stood there for a moment longer, watching him split log after log with mechanical precision, then turned and walked back to the barn, her mind churning with questions she didn't know how to ask. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Ethan Cole rose before dawn, tended his horses, worked his land. The Moores remained in the barn trying to be as invisible as possible, though with 11 children that was nearly impossible. Twice a day, Ethan brought food, simple meals, never elaborate, but always enough. Bread and butter, more stew, beans and salt pork. Once, incredibly, a chicken he'd roasted whole. He never stayed to watch them eat, never asked questions, never seemed to expect thanks or conversation. He would simply set the food down, sometimes add firewood to the pile he'd started leaving near the barn door, and disappear again into his work. Eliza tried to respect his obvious desire for distance, but it went against every instinct she had. She was accustomed to earning her keep, to justifying her existence through labor. This passive acceptance of generosity felt wrong, like building a house on sand. On the 4th day, she couldn't stand it anymore. She waited until she saw Ethan heading toward the small vegetable garden behind his house, then intercepted him with determination in her step. Mr. Cole, I need to speak with you. He stopped, his expression wary. Mrs. Moore. This arrangement can't continue, she said firmly. You're feeding 13 people, providing shelter, asking nothing in return. It's not sustainable, and it's not right. Told you— I know what you told me, Eliza interrupted, then softened her tone. And I appreciate it more than you know. But please, let us help. Look at your garden. It's choked with weeds. Your fences need mending. Your house could use cleaning. Let me work. Let my older children work. Give us a way to feel like we're contributing something. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his blue-gray eyes unreadable. Then he glanced toward the barn where Matthew and John were visible in the doorway, watching the exchange with anxious faces. How old are those boys? He asked. Matthew is 15. John is 13. He nodded slowly as if considering. They know horses? Their father taught them some, before he died. Another long pause. Then, could use help with the fence line in the east pasture. Posts are rotting, needs replacing before winter. Relief flooded through Eliza so powerfully she felt dizzy. They can do that. They're good workers, both of them, and I can— Garden could use attention, he admitted, his tone reluctant. If you're wanting to work it. Yes, Eliza said quickly. Yes, thank you. And the little ones can help with smaller tasks. Rebecca is excellent with mending, and Sarah can— Mrs. Moore. He held up a hand, stopping her flood of words. No need to assign everyone jobs. Just do what seems needful. If it helps you feel better about staying. He started to turn away, then paused, looking back at her with an expression that might have been concern. Your children? They getting enough to eat? The question, asked so bluntly, caught Eliza off guard. Yes, thanks to you, they're eating better than they have in months. The baby too? Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm managing. Ethan's eyes dropped to where she held William against her shoulder, and she knew he could see how thin she'd become. How the dress that had once fit her properly now hung loose. A nursing mother needed to eat well, and she'd been giving most of her portions to the older children, trying to stretch Ethan's generosity as far as possible. Starting tomorrow, he said gruffly, there'll be milk from the cow for you and the baby. Mr. Cole, we can't possibly. Cow needs milking anyway. May as well use it. Before she could protest further, he strode off toward the garden, leaving Eliza standing there with tears threatening once again. Every time she thought she'd found the limit of this man's kindness, he extended it further, offering more than she'd dared to ask for. That afternoon, Matthew and John went with Ethan to survey the fence line. Eliza watched them go with her heart in her throat, hoping desperately that her boys would prove themselves capable, that they wouldn't disappoint this man who was giving them such an extraordinary chance. She turned her attention to the garden, where weeds had indeed taken over much of the space between neat rows of vegetables. Rebecca came to help her, and together they began the slow work of pulling weeds, their hands moving through the dirt, while the younger children played nearby under Sarah's supervision. "Mama," Rebecca said quietly, after they'd worked in silence for a while, "do you think we can really stay here?" Eliza sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I don't know, sweetheart. Mr. Cole has been incredibly generous, but we can't presume this will last forever." "He seems lonely," Rebecca observed, her young face thoughtful. "The way he lives out here by himself? No family, no neighbors nearby, just him and his horses and his work." It was true. In the days they'd been here, Eliza hadn't seen any sign of other people. No visitors, no friends stopping by, no indication that Ethan Cole had any life beyond the boundaries of his isolated homestead. "Some people prefer solitude," Eliza said gently. "Or maybe they're just used to it," Rebecca countered. "That's not the same as preferring it." Eliza looked at her daughter with something approaching awe. At 13, Rebecca already possessed a wisdom beyond her years, an ability to see past surfaces to the truth beneath. It was a gift born of hardship, and Eliza wished desperately that her daughter could have remained innocent a little longer. When the boys returned at dusk, their faces were tired but lit with something Eliza hadn't seen in months: pride. Matthew couldn't stop talking about the work, his words tumbling over each other in his excitement. "He knows so much, Mama, about wood and tools and how to set a post so it'll last. And he didn't treat us like children. He showed us what to do and then trusted us to do it. John and I pulled out 6 rotten posts today, and tomorrow we'll start setting the new ones. And Mr. Cole said we're doing good work. He actually said that." "Good work," he said. John was quieter, but Eliza could see the same satisfaction in his eyes. For the first time since their father's death, her sons had been allowed to be useful, to be capable, to be valued for something other than being burdens. That night, after the children had settled into sleep, Eliza sat in the barn doorway and looked out at the stars. The prairie night was alive with sound, crickets and distant coyotes, the rustle of grass in the wind, the soft movements of horses in their stalls. From the small house, she could see a single light burning in the window, and she wondered what Ethan Cole was doing in there. Was he reading? Sitting alone with his thoughts? Did he ever regret allowing this invasion of his carefully ordered solitude? A week passed, then 2. The children grew stronger, their hollow cheeks filling out, their movements less listless. The older ones worked alongside Eliza, Matthew and John on the fence line, Rebecca in the garden. Even young Sarah, helping with smaller tasks like gathering eggs from the chicken coop Ethan showed them behind the barn. Ethan himself remained largely distant, though Eliza began to notice small changes. He would pause sometimes to watch Matthew and John work, offering a quiet word of instruction or approval. He brought the milk as promised, and once when he saw how thin Eliza's shawl was, he left a heavier blanket folded by the barn door without comment. The children began to relax around him, their initial fear fading into cautious curiosity. Little Sarah started smiling when she saw him, and once the twins actually waved. Ethan never quite smiled back, But Eliza thought she saw his expression soften slightly, the hard lines around his mouth easing just a fraction. One evening, Eliza was preparing the cornmeal mush that had become their staple supper when she realized the firewood had run out. She'd been building small cooking fires outside the barn, careful to keep them controlled and safe, but now she had nothing to burn. She glanced toward Ethan's house, debating whether to ask for more wood or simply make do with raw grain soaked in water. Before she could decide, Ethan appeared with an armload of split logs. He dropped them near her cooking spot without a word, then started to leave. "Mr. Cole," Eliza called after him, unable to hold back the question that had been building inside her. "Why are you doing this?" He stopped, but didn't turn around. "Doing what?" "All of it. The food, the shelter, the work for my boys. You don't know us. We're strangers who invaded your property. You could have sent us away that first night, and no one would have blamed you. So why didn't you?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire Eliza had started. Then, finally, he turned to face her. "Had a sister once," he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "She was widowed young, 3 children, nowhere to go when her husband's family turned her out. I was working a ranch 2 territories away, didn't know she needed help until it was too late." "What happened to her?" Eliza asked softly. "Winter took her. And the children." His face was carved from stone, but his eyes held an old grief that would never fully heal. Found out 6 months after. By then, there wasn't even anyone left to bury properly. Eliza's hand rose to her mouth. "I'm so sorry." "So when I opened my barn door and saw you and your children sleeping there," he paused, his jaw working. "Wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Wasn't going to be the kind of man who turns away someone who needs help." Understanding flooded through Eliza, sharp and painful. This wasn't about her or her children specifically. This was about his sister, about a debt he could never repay, a guilt he could never absolve. They were benefiting from a grief that had shaped him into someone who couldn't turn away from desperation. "Mr. Cole?" "Food's getting cold," he interrupted, nodding toward her pot. "Should eat while it's hot." He walked away before she could say anything else, disappearing into his house and closing the door firmly behind him. Eliza stood staring after him, her heart aching for this lonely man trying to save his sister by saving strangers, trying to fix a past that was broken beyond repair. The next morning, she woke to find that Ethan had left supplies outside the barn before dawn. Flour, sugar, dried beans, even a precious jar of honey. No note, no explanation. Just another offering laid at the feet of strangers who reminded him of people he couldn't save. Eliza gathered the supplies carefully, her hands reverent, and made a decision. If Ethan Cole was trying to atone for his sister's death by helping her family survive, then she would honor that by making sure they didn't just survive. They would live. They would thrive. They would prove that his kindness mattered, that it changed something, that it meant something real. She would give him that, at least. The first snow came early that year, arriving in late October with a ferocity that caught even Ethan by surprise. Eliza woke to find the world transformed, the prairie buried under white, the wind howling around the barn with a sound like wolves crying. Inside their corner of the structure, the children huddled together for warmth, their breath making clouds in the frigid air. The blanket Ethan had given them wasn't enough. Nothing was enough against cold like this. Eliza could feel it seeping through the barn walls, creeping into their bones, and when little Joseph started coughing, a wet, rattling sound that terrified her, she knew they couldn't stay here another night. But where could they go? Back into the storm? Into another town that would reject them just as redemption had. She was still trying to decide when the barn door opened and Ethan appeared, his coat white with snow, his face grim. He took one look at the shivering children and shook his head. "Can't stay out here," he said flatly. "Not in this. Get them up. You're coming inside." Eliza's heart lurched. "Mr. Cole, we can't impose—" "Wasn't asking." His tone left no room for argument. "This storm's going to last days, maybe a week. That baby won't survive it out here, and you know it." He was right, and Eliza hated how right he was. She hated being this helpless, this dependent, this grateful. But pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when her children's lives hung in the balance. "Children," she said quietly, "gather our things. We're going to Mr. Cole's house." The older children moved quickly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Matthew and John rolled up the blanket while Rebecca helped the younger ones into their threadbare coats. Ethan watched them work, and when they were ready, he led them through the storm to his house. It was small inside, smaller than Eliza had imagined. One main room that served as kitchen and living space, with a fireplace that radiated blessed heat. A door led to what must be his bedroom, and a ladder climbed to a small loft space. Simple furniture, everything worn but well maintained. The home of a man who lived alone and had never expected company. Now that home was invaded by 13 people tracking snow across the floor, dripping melted ice, filling every available space with their presence. Ethan stood by the fireplace and cleared his throat. "Loft's got some old blankets stored up there. You and the older children can sleep there. Younger ones can take my bed. I'll make do out here." "We can't take your bed," Eliza protested. "We'll all manage in the loft, or Mrs. Moore." He looked at her directly, his blue-gray eyes steady. "I'm not arguing about this. Put the little ones in the warm bed. That's the end of it." There was something in his voice, not anger, but a kind of weariness with her constant protests, that made Eliza nod. She guided Mary, Joseph, and the twins into the bedroom, her heart aching at how small they looked in the big bed, how they burrowed immediately under the quilts like animals seeking shelter. The rest of them arranged themselves as best they could. Rebecca took the baby up to the loft with Sarah and Ruth. Matthew and John found spots near the fireplace where they could stretch out. Eliza herself ended up in a corner, her back against the wall, watching as Ethan moved around his suddenly crowded house with the stiff movements of someone deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people. That much was obvious. The way he kept his distance, the way his eyes flickered nervously whenever one of the children moved too close, the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing against an invasion. This was a man who had built his life around solitude, and now that solitude had been shattered by the very people he was trying to save. The storm raged for 3 days. 3 long days trapped inside the small house, the wind screaming outside, the snow piling higher and higher against the walls. Eliza tried to keep the children quiet and contained, but it was impossible with 11 of them in such close quarters. They were restless, bored, their cabin fever growing with each passing hour. Ethan spent most of his time outside, braving the storm to tend to his animals, returning only for meals and to sleep in front of the fireplace, his body curved away from the room full of people who had taken over his space. Eliza could feel his discomfort radiating like heat, and it twisted something inside her chest. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. The wind died, the sun emerged, and the prairie became a blinding expanse of white. Ethan was out the door before dawn, and Eliza didn't see him again until late afternoon. She was preparing supper, a stew made from supplies she'd found in Ethan's well-stocked pantry, when Matthew came running in, his face flushed with cold and something else. Excitement? No, Eliza realized with a sinking feeling. Fear. "Mama," he said breathlessly. "There are men coming, riders, 4 of them." Eliza's hand stilled over the pot. "Did they see you?" "I don't think so. I was checking the fence line like Mr. Cole showed me. They were still maybe a mile out, but they're heading this way." Through the window, Eliza could see Ethan near the barn, his body alert, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He'd seen them too. The riders grew larger as they approached, and Eliza counted them, 4 men on horseback, moving with purpose across the snow. "Children," she said quietly, "go to the loft. All of you, stay there until I say otherwise." "But Mama," John started. "Now." They obeyed, even Matthew, though Eliza could see the rebellion in his eyes. He was 15, nearly a man, and he didn't want to hide like a child. But he went, and within moments the house was quiet, except for Eliza's pounding heart. She stood at the window and watched as the riders reached Ethan's property. They didn't stop at a respectful distance. They rode right up to where he stood, their horses stamping and blowing in the cold air, and Eliza recognized one of them with a jolt of pure terror. Mr. Hutchins. From Redemption. She couldn't hear what they were saying from inside the house, but she could read the tension in every line of Ethan's body, could see the aggressive posture of the men surrounding him. Mr. Hutchins was doing most of the talking. his gestures broad and emphatic, while Ethan stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest. Unable to bear the not knowing, Eliza wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, but she forced herself forward until she could hear the conversation. "Just telling you as a courtesy," Mr. Hutchins was saying, his voice carrying across the snow. "That woman and her brood are nothing but trouble. Brought sickness to our town, and now she's probably doing the same to you." "Haven't seen any sickness here," Ethan said, his voice flat and cold. "Yet," one of the other men interjected. He was younger, and Eliza recognized him as Thomas Green, the boy who'd held the shovel like a weapon back in Redemption. "But you will. That's what happens when you harbor cursed folk." "Cursed," Ethan repeated, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. "You rode all this way to warn me about curses?" "We rode out here to do our Christian duty," Mr. Hutchins said sanctimoniously. "To warn a fellow man about the danger he's letting sleep under his roof. That woman is a burden everywhere she goes. 11 children, Cole. 11 mouths to feed, 11 bodies taking up space. How long before you realize you've made a mistake? How long before they drag you down too?" Ethan's jaw tightened, and Eliza saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. "Think it's time you left my property?" "We're just trying to help you see sense," Thomas Green pressed. "Send her away now before winter really sets in. Before those children get too comfortable. You're a single man. What do you need with a ready-made family, especially one that's nothing but trouble?" "My property," Ethan said again, his voice dropping to something low and threatening. "My business. Not yours." Mr. Hutchins leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "You claiming them, then? This widow and her collection of brats? You taking responsibility for what happens when they bring their bad luck here?" The question hung in the cold air like a challenge. Eliza held her breath, shame and fear warring inside her chest. This was it. The moment when Ethan would realize that helping them wasn't worth the social cost, wasn't worth being associated with people his own kind considered cursed and contaminated. Ethan turned his head slightly, and his eyes found Eliza standing in the doorway. For a long moment, their gazes locked, and she tried to convey everything she couldn't say aloud, her gratitude, her understanding, her willingness to leave if that would make his life easier. Then Ethan turned back to the men on horseback, and his voice rang out clear and hard. "Yes, I'm claiming them. This is my land, and they belong on it. Mrs. Moore and her children are under my protection. Anyone has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold still, as if the whole world had paused to absorb what Ethan had just declared. Mr. Hutchins recovered first, his face flushing dark with anger. "You're making a mistake, Cole, a big one. When those children bring disease and death to your door, don't say we didn't warn you." "Noted," Ethan said coldly. "Now get off my land." "The town won't forget this," Thomas Green added, his young face twisted with malice. "You're choosing her over your own kind, over decent folk who would have been your friends and neighbors. You'll regret it." "Maybe," Ethan agreed, his tone unconcerned. "But that's my choice to make. Just like it's my choice to tell you one last time, leave, now, before I make you leave." There was enough menace in his voice to make even Mr. Hutchins reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. He jerked his horse's head around, and the other men followed suit, their mounts churning up snow as they turned and rode away. They didn't look back, but Eliza could feel their anger like heat waves shimmering in the cold air. When they were finally gone, disappeared into the white distance, Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly. He stood there for a moment longer, staring after them, then turned and walked toward the house. Eliza stepped aside to let him pass, and inside he went straight to the fireplace, his hands gripping the mantel, his head bowed. She closed the door behind her and waited, her heart hammering, not sure what to say or do. "Mr. Cole," she began quietly, "I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to—" "Don't." His voice was rough, strained. "Don't apologize for needing help." "But they're right about one thing," Eliza pressed on, the words tumbling out. "We are a burden. We are too many. And now you've made yourself an outcast because of us. Those men, They'll tell everyone. The whole territory will know you chose to help us instead of sending us away." "Good," Ethan said, and when he turned to face her, his eyes were blazing with something fierce and determined. "Let them know. Let them all know that I don't turn away people who need shelter, that I don't measure a person's worth by how convenient they are, that I won't abandon a woman and her children to freeze on the prairie just because it might make my neighbors uncomfortable." Eliza felt tears streaming down her face, hot against her frozen cheeks. "You don't understand what you've done. You've tied yourself to us. You've claimed us, in front of witnesses. That means—" "I know what it means," Ethan interrupted. He took a step toward her, and his voice gentled slightly. "I knew what I was saying when I said it. I'm not a fool, Mrs. Moore. I knew exactly what I was claiming." "But why?" The question broke from her like a sob. "Why would you do that? Why would you sacrifice your reputation, your standing, your chance at a normal life for strangers?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something vulnerable and honest. "Because you're not strangers anymore," he said quietly. "Because I see Matthew working the fence line every day until his hands are raw, trying to prove he's worth the food he eats. Because I hear Rebecca singing to the little ones at night, keeping their spirits up. Because I watch you give your portions to the children and pretend you're not hungry. Because—" he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because I look at your family and I don't see a burden. I see people trying their best, and that matters." The tears were falling faster now, and Eliza couldn't stop them. In that moment, she felt something crack open inside her chest. All the fear and shame and desperate gratitude she'd been holding back for weeks. All the weight of being unwanted and cast out. All the lonely terror of trying to keep her children alive in a world that didn't care if they lived or died. And here was this man, this quiet, solitary man, telling her they mattered, telling her she mattered. "Thank you," she whispered, because it was all she could manage. Ethan nodded once, then cleared his throat and stepped back, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion filling the small room. "Children can come down now. Storm's past. We'll need to dig out the barn, make sure the animals are all right." As if his words had broken a spell, the children began climbing down from the loft, their faces anxious and uncertain. They'd heard everything. Of course they had. The house was too small for secrets. Matthew was the first to reach Ethan, and the boy stuck out his hand with an awkward formality that would have been endearing if it wasn't so heartbreaking. "Thank you, sir, for standing up for us. For my mama." Ethan looked at the offered hand for a moment, then took it, his large palm swallowing Matthew's calloused one. "You've earned your place here with your work. All of you have." One by one, the children approached him, not crowding, not overwhelming, but each finding their own way to express gratitude. Rebecca offered a shy smile. John promised to work harder than ever. Even little Sarah, brave Sarah, walked up and slipped her small hand into Ethan's for just a moment before darting away again. Eliza watched it all through her tears, watched this man who claimed he didn't need people slowly being surrounded by her children, slowly being pulled into the orbit of their messy, complicated, desperately loving family. That night, after the barn had been dug out and the animals tended and supper eaten, Eliza lay in the loft listening to the breathing of her sleeping children around her. Below, she could hear Ethan moving about quietly, banking the fire for the night, settling into his makeshift bed by the hearth. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges. The men from Redemption would spread word about Ethan's choice, and there would be consequences. There always were. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas had died and left her alone with 11 children and no way to provide for them, Eliza felt something dangerous and fragile unfurling in her chest. Hope. Real hope. Not the desperate kind that came from having no other choice, but the kind that whispered maybe, just maybe, they had found a place where they could stay, where they could belong, where someone had chosen them. The weeks that followed were harder than anything Eliza had anticipated. The snow continued to fall, burying the prairie under drifts that sometimes reached the windows. The cold was relentless, seeping into every crack and corner, making even simple tasks exhausting. But worse than the weather was the isolation. No one came to visit. No one stopped by to check on them or offer seasonal greetings. The few times Ethan made the long ride into the nearest town for supplies, a place called Silver Creek, larger and farther than Redemption. He returned tight-lipped and tense, saying nothing about what he'd encountered there. But Eliza could guess. She'd seen the way gossip worked, the way a story could spread like wildfire across the prairie, jumping from town to town, growing more distorted with each telling. By now, everyone within 100 miles probably knew about the widow, with too many children who'd ensnared some poor fool into taking them in. "Let them talk," Ethan said once, when Eliza tried to apologize for the obvious social cost he was paying. "Talk doesn't hurt anything." But it did hurt. Eliza could see it in the way his shoulders hunched when he came back from town, in the way he grew quieter and more withdrawn, retreating into himself like a wounded animal seeking shelter. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him he didn't have to bear this alone, but she didn't know how. Didn't know what words could possibly bridge the gap between grateful dependence and something more equal, more mutual. Christmas came and went with little fanfare. Eliza tried to make it special for the children, telling them stories and singing carols, rationing out a bit of the precious sugar to make simple cookies. Ethan disappeared into his bedroom for most of the day, emerging only for meals, his face carefully neutral. It wasn't until the children were asleep that night that Eliza found him outside, standing in the snow, staring up at stars so bright and cold they looked like ice chips scattered across black velvet. "Mr. Cole," she said softly, pulling her shawl tighter against the brutal cold. "Are you all right?" "Fine," he said, but his voice was hollow. Eliza moved to stand beside him, and they stayed there in silence for several minutes, their breath making clouds in the frigid air. Finally, she worked up the courage to ask what she'd been wondering. "Do you regret it, letting us stay?" "No," Ethan said immediately, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "Never that." "Then what is it? What's troubling you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, the words began to come. "My sister. She died at Christmas. Her and the children. That's when the cold took them. I found out on Christmas Day, got the letter from a preacher who'd found their bodies in an abandoned claim shack 2 territories over." Eliza's heart broke for him. "I'm so sorry. Every Christmas since, I've been alone. Chose to be alone. Couldn't stand the thought of people celebrating when she was gone, when I'd failed her." He paused, his jaw working. "But tonight, listening to your children singing, watching them happy despite having so little, it was the first time in 7 years I didn't spend Christmas wishing I was dead too." The raw honesty of it stole Eliza's breath. She reached out without thinking and took his hand, and when he didn't pull away, she held on tight. "Your sister would be glad," she said quietly, "that you're helping us, that you're choosing life over grief." "Maybe," Ethan said, and his fingers tightened around hers. "Maybe." They stood there together until the cold drove them inside, and something had shifted between them, something subtle but significant. A recognition that they were both carrying grief, both trying to survive losses that had nearly destroyed them, both learning how to build something new from the wreckage of what they'd lost. January brought temperatures so cold that water froze solid in the bucket overnight. The children could barely go outside without risking frostbite, so they stayed huddled around the fireplace, the older ones helping the younger ones with reading and numbers, everyone trying to stay occupied in the cramped space. Ethan spent more time inside too, unable to work in the brutal cold. At first, he seemed uncomfortable with the constant presence of people, but gradually Eliza noticed him relaxing. He began teaching Matthew and John how to carve wood, showing them how to shape simple tools and utensils. He let the younger children watch as he mended tack and repaired equipment. Once, Eliza even caught him smiling, actually smiling, when little Joseph proudly showed him a crooked wooden horse the boy had attempted to whittle. The house felt less like a shelter they'd invaded and more like a home they were building together. But the test of whether they truly belonged was still coming. It arrived in early February, on a day when the temperature had climbed just high enough to make travel possible. Eliza was preparing the midday meal when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, and the sound of wagon wheels. Ethan heard it too. He set down the bridle he'd been oiling and moved to the window, his body going tense. "Stay inside," he told Eliza, then stepped out into the cold. Through the window, Eliza watched as a group of perhaps 8 or 9 people approached. Men and women both, some on horseback, others in 2 wagons. They stopped in front of the house, and a woman Eliza didn't recognize climbed down from the lead wagon. She was well-dressed, her coat fine wool, her bearing that of someone accustomed to authority and respect. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the cold air. "Mr. Cole, I presume. My name is Mrs. Margaret Ashford. I'm from Silver Creek, and I've come to discuss a matter of some concern to our community." Ethan's stance didn't change. "Mrs. Ashford. I'll be direct," the woman continued. "There's been talk about your situation here, about the woman and children you've taken in. Now, we understand that charitable impulses are admirable, but there are proper ways to handle these things. The children should be in an orphanage where they can be properly cared for and educated. As for the widow, well, surely there are more appropriate arrangements that could be made." Eliza's blood turned to ice. They'd come to take her children. These well-meaning strangers had decided that her family should be torn apart for their own good. "The children are fine where they are," Ethan said, his voice hard. "Mr. Cole, please be reasonable. 11 children, that's far too many for one woman to manage, especially in these conditions. And living here in such close quarters with an unmarried man, well..." Mrs. Ashford's voice took on a tone of practiced sympathy. "We're concerned about propriety, about the children's welfare and moral education. Their welfare is fine. Their moral education is none of your business." "I'm afraid it is our business," another voice interjected, a man this time, pompous and self-important. "We have a responsibility to the vulnerable members of our community. These children need structure, discipline, proper Christian upbringing, not to be living in a barn like animals." "They're not in the barn anymore," Ethan said flatly. "They're in my house, under my roof, under my protection." Mrs. Ashford stepped closer, her expression calculating. "Then perhaps we should discuss a more permanent arrangement. If you feel responsible for them, Mr. Cole, the proper thing would be to make the widow an honest woman, give the children a legitimate home." The suggestion hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Eliza's face burned with humiliation. This woman was suggesting Ethan marry her, not out of affection or choice, but out of obligation, to make things respectable, to satisfy the community's sense of propriety. "What I do on my own land is my business," Ethan repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You people have no right to come here and tell me how to live, no right to suggest taking those children away from their mother, no right to any of this. We have every right to protect children from unsuitable situations," the pompous man shot back. "And this is unsuitable, Cole. A widow and her brood living with a bachelor, it's scandalous. It reflects poorly on our entire community." Something inside Ethan seemed to snap. He took a step forward, and there was such fury in his movement that several of the visitors actually stepped back. "Get off my land," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you, take your concern and your propriety and your judgments and get the hell off my property. Mr. Cole, now!" The roar echoed across the snow, final and absolute. Mrs. Ashford looked like she'd been slapped, her mouth opening and closing without sound. The pompous man puffed up with indignation, but one look at Ethan's face seemed to convince him that arguing further would be unwise. They retreated to their wagons and horses, Mrs. Ashford calling back one last time. "This isn't over, Mr. Cole. We'll be back with the territorial authorities if necessary. Those children deserve better than this." "They've got everything they need," Ethan shouted after them, "and they're not going anywhere." Eliza watched through the window as the group departed, their righteous outrage almost visible in the air around them. When they were finally out of sight, Ethan turned back to the house, his face still dark with anger. He came inside and stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, his fists clenched at his sides. The children stared at him with wide eyes, having heard everything through the thin walls. "Mr. Cole," Eliza began, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to bring this kind of attention to you. Maybe they're right. Maybe the children would be better off." "Don't!" Ethan interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." He looked at her, really looked at her, and his eyes were blazing. "Those people don't care about your children's welfare. They care about rules and respectability and making sure everyone fits into their neat little boxes. Well, I don't fit in boxes. Never have. And I'll be damned if I let them tear apart a family just because it makes them uncomfortable." But they said they'd come back, Rebecca said quietly from her spot near the fire. With authorities. Let them try, Ethan said grimly. This is my land, legally owned. I've done nothing illegal. And if they want to make an issue of it, they'll find out exactly how stubborn I can be. He looked around at all of them, at Matthew and John with their half-carved pieces of wood, at Rebecca holding the baby, at the younger children clustered together for comfort, at Eliza with tears streaming down her face. You're staying, he said firmly. All of you. For as long as you need. For as long as you want. And anyone who has a problem with that will have to go through me first. In that moment, standing in his small house surrounded by her children, Eliza felt something click into place inside her heart. This wasn't just shelter anymore. This wasn't just charity or obligation or one man trying to atone for his sister's death. This was a choice, a deliberate, conscious choice to stand together against a world that wanted to tear them apart. This was belonging. And for the first time since Thomas died, Eliza allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found home. The threatened return of the authorities never came. Whether Mrs. Ashford had been bluffing or whether Ethan's fury had convinced them to find easier battles to fight, Eliza didn't know and didn't care. What mattered was that February turned to March, and they were still there, still together, still building something that resembled a life. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly, the prairie emerging from its blanket of white in patches of brown and gray. With the warming weather came work, endless work. The winter had damaged fences, weakened structures, created 100 small problems that needed fixing before spring planting could begin. Ethan worked from dawn until well past dark, and Matthew and John worked alongside him, their young bodies growing stronger with each passing day. Eliza watched her oldest sons transform before her eyes, watched them gain muscle and confidence, watched them learn to move with purpose and pride. They looked at Ethan with something approaching worship, hanging on his every word of instruction, desperate to prove themselves worthy of his time and trust. You're good with them, Eliza told Ethan one evening as they stood together watching the boys practice the post-hole digging technique he'd taught them. Better than their father was, if I'm being honest. Ethan looked uncomfortable with the compliment. Thomas More was a good man. Everyone said so. He was, Eliza agreed, surprising herself with how easily she could say it now. But he was gone a lot, working whatever jobs he could find. The boys barely knew him. You've taught them more in 4 months than he taught them in their whole lives. They're good workers, Ethan said gruffly. Smart. Pay attention. They worship you, Eliza said softly. You know that, don't you? Ethan's jaw tightened and he turned away from her scrutiny. They shouldn't. I'm just teaching them what they need to know to survive. That's exactly why they do, Eliza countered. Because you're preparing them for life, giving them skills and knowledge and the confidence to use both. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? He didn't answer, just walked away to check on something in the barn, but Eliza saw the tension in his shoulders and knew her words had affected him more than he wanted to admit. As the weather improved, Eliza threw herself into making the homestead not just functional, but beautiful. She attacked the vegetable garden with fierce determination, expanding it, planning what they would plant come full spring. She cleaned every corner of the small house until it gleamed. She mended Ethan's clothes, patched his worn shirts, even attempted to make curtains from fabric she'd carefully unpicked from her own spare dress. You don't need to do all this, Ethan said one afternoon, finding her elbow deep in a bucket of wash water, scrubbing his work shirts until her knuckles were raw. I want to, Eliza replied firmly. You've given us so much. Let me give something back. You're already working too hard. The garden, the cleaning, the children, the cooking. I can handle it. Eliza. He'd started using her first name sometime during the long winter, though she couldn't remember exactly when the transition had happened. You're going to wear yourself out. She looked up at him, her hands still in the soapy water. I need to be useful, Ethan. I need to contribute. Can you understand that? Something in her voice must have reached him because he nodded slowly. Just don't kill yourself trying to prove your worth. You've already proven it. The words settled into Eliza's chest like warm stones, and she carried them with her through the long days that followed. Rebecca turned 14 in late March, and Eliza was startled to realize how much her daughter had grown. The girl was nearly as tall as Eliza herself now, her movements gaining a grace that spoke of approaching womanhood. She'd taken on so much responsibility with the younger children, becoming a second mother to them, and sometimes Eliza caught glimpses of the woman Rebecca would become, strong, capable, kind. "Mama," Rebecca said one evening as they worked together preparing supper, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Do you think we'll stay here? Permanently, I mean?" Eliza's hands stilled over the bread dough she was kneading. "I don't know. Why do you ask?" "Because the little ones are starting to think of this as home," Rebecca said carefully. "They're getting attached. To the house, to the land, to—" She paused, then finished quietly. "To Mr. Cole." "And you?" Eliza asked. "Are you getting attached too?" Rebecca smiled, a small, knowing smile that made her look far older than 14. "I've been watching you, Mama. The way you look at him when you think no one's paying attention. The way he looks at you." Heat flooded Eliza's cheeks. "Rebecca, that's not—" "It's all right," Rebecca interrupted gently. "I think it would be good, for all of us. He's a good man, and we need him. But more than that, I think he needs us too." Eliza stared at her daughter, stunned by the perception in those young eyes. "We can't presume anything," she said finally. "Mr. Cole has been generous beyond measure, but that doesn't mean he wants to be permanently tied to a ready-made family. He has his own life, his own plans." "Does he?" Rebecca challenged. "Because from where I stand, he looks like a man who's been waiting for something to fill up all the empty spaces in his life. And we've done that. Look around, Mama. This house has life in it now. Laughter, purpose. He's different than he was when we first came. Less alone." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to caution Rebecca against hope that might be misplaced, but she couldn't, because her daughter was right. Ethan had changed. The hard edges had softened. The silences had grown more comfortable. The way he moved through the house, their house, it felt like now, had shifted from reluctant tolerance to something that looked almost like contentment. But contentment wasn't the same as commitment, and Eliza had learned the hard way not to build dreams on unstable foundations. April brought rain, torrential rain that turned the prairie into a sea of mud and tested every roof and wall on the property. The small house leaked in 3 places, and Eliza spent a miserable night moving buckets around to catch the drips while the children huddled together trying to stay dry. The next morning, Ethan climbed onto the roof despite the continuing drizzle and spent the entire day patching and repairing. When he finally came down, soaked and exhausted, Eliza had hot coffee waiting and a towel for him to dry off with. "Thank you," she said simply. He accepted the coffee, wrapping his cold hands around the cup. "Roof should have been fixed before winter. I let it go too long." "You didn't know you'd have 13 people depending on it," Eliza pointed out. "Maybe not," Ethan agreed. "But I do now." The simple statement held weight beyond its words. I do now. Present tense. Ongoing. Not temporary charity, but acknowledged responsibility. That night, after the children were asleep and the rain had finally stopped, Eliza found Ethan sitting on the porch step, staring out at the muddy yard. She sat down beside him, pulling her shawl close against the damp chill. "Penny for your thoughts," she offered. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I was thinking about my sister, about how she used to sit on the porch at our parents' house and plan out her future. She had such dreams, wanted a big family, a piece of land to call her own, a husband who'd love her and her children. She got some of it, the husband, the children. But the land—" He paused, his voice roughening. "She died in a shack that didn't even keep the wind out, let alone the cold." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly. "She would have liked you," Ethan continued. "Would have liked your children. She always said that a full house was a blessed house." He turned to look at Eliza, and in the dim light from the window behind them, his eyes were serious. "I failed her. But I won't fail you. Won't let what happened to her happen to your family." "You haven't failed anyone," Eliza said firmly. "You've saved us. You're still saving us, every single day." "Not saving," Ethan corrected. "Just sharing what I have. There's a difference." "Is there?" Eliza asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks an awful lot like you've given us everything while asking nothing in return. That's not true. Ethan's voice was low, almost hesitant. You've given me plenty. What could we possibly have given you? We came here with nothing. We still have nothing. Ethan gestured toward the house behind them, where the children slept safe and warm. You've given me purpose, reason to fix the roof, to plant a bigger garden, to care about whether the fences hold through the next storm. Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, working because that's what you do, not because it mattered. But now, he trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. Now? Eliza prompted gently. Now I wake up and there's breakfast cooking and children's voices and life happening all around me, Ethan said quietly. Now I fix things because I know people are depending on them. Now I plan for the future because there are people to share it with. You think you've given me nothing, but you've given me everything that matters. Eliza felt tears pricking her eyes. Ethan, I know I'm not easy to live with, he interrupted, as if afraid of what she might say. I know I'm rough around the edges, not much for talking, set in my ways. I know taking on another man's children isn't something most people would choose. But if you and the children are willing to stay, if you can stand living here with me, then I'd like you to stay. Permanent-like. The words hung between them, not quite a proposal, but something close to it, an offer, an invitation, a tentative reaching towards something more than temporary arrangement. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest. Are you sure? 11 children, Ethan. That's not a small thing. I've been living with 11 children for months now, he pointed out. Seems to me I'm already doing it. Might as well make it official. Official, Eliza repeated. What exactly are you suggesting? Ethan's face flushed, visible even in the dim light. I'm suggesting that maybe we should think about making this arrangement more permanent, legal-like. So those busybodies can't come back and try to take the children, so you don't have to worry about where you'll go or how you'll manage, so we can just be a family. Eliza's breath caught. A family? If you want, Ethan said quickly. No pressure. I know it's not romantic or anything fancy. I know I'm not offering you much, just hard work and a small house and a stubborn man who doesn't always know how to say what he means. But I'd take care of you, all of you, best I could. For a long moment, Eliza couldn't speak. Emotions warred inside her chest, hope and fear, gratitude and uncertainty, the bone-deep loneliness of the past year clashing with the tentative warmth of the past few months. I need time, she said finally, to think, to make sure this is right for everyone. Take all the time you need, Ethan said, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice. I'm not going anywhere. They sat in silence for a while longer, and when Eliza finally rose to go inside, Ethan caught her hand briefly, just a gentle squeeze, there and gone, but enough to send warmth flooding through her entire body. Inside, lying in the loft beside her sleeping children, Eliza stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through the tangle of her thoughts. Marriage to Ethan would solve so many problems, would give the children security, would provide them with a father figure they desperately needed, would end the uncertainty that shadowed every day. But was that enough reason to marry? Practicality and gratitude? What about love? The question haunted her through the days that followed. She watched Ethan with new eyes, paying attention to things she'd been trying not to notice. The way he patiently taught little Joseph how to whistle. The way he listened when Sarah chattered endlessly about nothing. The way he made sure Matthew and John took breaks from their work, reminding them they were still boys, not machines. The way he looked at Eliza herself when he thought she wasn't watching, a look that held warmth and something that might be longing. Could she love him? Or more accurately, was she already starting to? The answer came unexpectedly on a warm May morning. Eliza was in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, when she heard a commotion from the direction of the barn. She stood quickly, her heart jumping into her throat, and saw Matthew running toward the house, his face pale. "Mama! Mama! Come quick! It's Mr. Cole!" Eliza dropped her trowel and ran, her skirts tangling around her legs. She found Ethan on the ground near the corral, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, his face white with pain. John stood over him, looking terrified. "What happened?" Eliza demanded, dropping to her knees beside Ethan. "Horse spooked," Ethan managed through gritted teeth. Through me. Legs broken. Eliza could see that for herself. The break was bad. Not compound, thank heavens, but definitely broken. Matthew, ride to Silver Creek and fetch the doctor. John, help me get him inside, carefully now. The next hours were a blur of activity and pain. The doctor arrived, set the leg with Ethan biting down on a leather strap to keep from crying out, then left instructions for keeping it clean and immobile. Ethan would be bedridden for weeks, the doctor said, longer if he didn't stay off it properly. That first night, after the children were settled and the house was quiet, Eliza sat beside Ethan's bed with a cool cloth for his fever. The setting had torn something inside him, and infection was a real danger. I'm sorry, Ethan mumbled, half delirious with pain and laudanum. Can't work, can't provide. Useless. Hush, Eliza said firmly, wiping his forehead. You're not useless. You're hurt, and you're going to heal. The planting, he muttered, needs to be done. The fence, Matthew and John will handle it, Eliza assured him. You've taught them well. They know what to do. Not ready, Ethan protested weakly. Too young. Then they'll learn by doing, Eliza said. The way you did. The way everyone does. Rest now. Let us take care of you for once. She stayed by his bedside through that long night, changing the cloth when it grew warm, giving him water when he stirred, watching his face in the lamplight. And somewhere in those quiet hours, as she sat vigil over this man who had given her family everything, Eliza realized the truth. She loved him. Not out of gratitude or obligation or practical necessity, but genuinely, truly loved him. Loved his quiet strength and his awkward kindness. Loved the way he saw her children not as burdens, but as people worth investing in. Loved how he'd claimed them in front of hostile witnesses, how he'd stood firm against judgment and criticism, how he'd made a place for them in his solitary life, even though it cost him socially and emotionally. She loved him, and the realization was both terrifying and liberating. The weeks of Ethan's recovery tested them all. Matthew and John took over the bulk of the physical work, rising before dawn and collapsing exhausted at night. Rebecca helped Eliza manage the house and the younger children. Even the littlest ones contributed what they could, fetching and carrying, running messages, trying to be helpful. And Eliza discovered something she hadn't expected. They could manage. The family could function, could survive, could even thrive without Ethan's constant labor. They had learned from him, absorbed his knowledge and work ethic, and now they were proving they could carry on. But more importantly, they wanted to. Not because they had to, but because this was their home now. This land, this house, this life they were building together. It belonged to all of them. Ethan watched from his bed, frustrated by his forced inactivity, but clearly moved by what he was witnessing. They're doing good work, he told Eliza one evening. Better than I expected. You trained them well, Eliza replied, adjusting his pillows. They're good boys. All of them. Your girls, too. Rebecca's got a head on her shoulders that would put most adults to shame. They love you, Eliza said softly. All of them. They want to make you proud. Ethan's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. A recognition, an understanding. I am proud of them, of you, of what we've built here. We, Eliza repeated. I like that word. So do I, Ethan admitted. More than I thought I would. When he was finally able to move around on crutches, Ethan insisted on hobbling outside to check on the work. What he found brought him to a complete stop. The fields had been planted, neat rows stretching across the acreage. The fences were repaired. The barn had been cleaned and organized. Even the vegetable garden had been weeded and expanded. Matthew and John stood nearby, watching his reaction with anxious hope. Well, Ethan said finally, his voice rough with emotion, looks like you boys don't need me anymore. That's not true, Matthew protested immediately. We need you. We wanted to show you we could help. Really help, not just be extra mouths to feed. Ethan reached out and clapped the boy on the shoulder, his grip firm despite the crutches. You've done more than help. You've made this place better than I ever did alone. The pride in Matthew's face was incandescent, and Eliza, watching from the porch, felt her heart swell with love for both her son and the man who'd given him this gift of competence and worth. By mid-June, Ethan was walking without crutches. though his legs still pained him. The summer had settled in hot and bright, and the homestead buzzed with activity. The garden was producing, the crops were growing, the animals were healthy. They'd survived the winter, survived the threats from outsiders, survived Ethan's injury. They'd survived together. One evening, after supper had been cleared and the children were occupied with their various activities, Eliza found Ethan standing by the fence, looking out over the land. She joined him, comfortable now with the silences between them. "I've been thinking," Ethan said after a while, "about what I said back in April, about making things permanent." Eliza's heart began to pound. "Have you changed your mind?" "No," he said immediately. "Opposite, actually. I'm more sure now than I was then. Watching how everyone pulled together when I was laid up, seeing how the boys have grown, how the little ones have settled in. This is what family looks like. This is what I want." "I've been thinking too," Eliza said quietly, "about what it means to build a life with someone, about partnership and trust and shared purpose." "And?" Ethan turned to face her fully, his expression guarded but hopeful. "And I think I'd like to make this permanent too," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Not just for the children's sake, though that's part of it, but for us. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival and started being about actually living, building something real and lasting." Ethan reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I know I'm not romantic. I know I can't offer you a fancy life or smooth words or—" "I don't want fancy," Eliza interrupted. "I want real. I want honest. I want someone who'll stand beside me when things get hard and celebrate with me when they get better. I want partnership built on respect and mutual effort. And I think that's what we've been building all along." "So that's a yes?" Ethan asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in his voice. "That's a yes," Eliza confirmed. "To making this permanent, to being a family, to choosing each other deliberately, not just out of necessity." Ethan smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Should probably ask you proper-like, make it official." "Probably should," Eliza agreed, her own smile matching his. But they stood there for a while longer, hands clasped, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, and neither of them felt the need to rush. They had time now. They had a future stretching out before them, full of work and challenges and ordinary days that would add up to an extraordinary life. They had each other, and they had chosen it. That was enough. The proper proposal came 3 days later, though not in any way Eliza had imagined. She was hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between 2 posts behind the house, the summer sun warm on her shoulders, when Ethan appeared beside her with something small clutched in his hand. "Got something for you," he said without preamble, his face slightly flushed. Eliza wiped her damp hands on her apron and turned to face him. In his palm lay a simple ring, not gold or silver, but carved from dark wood, polished until it gleamed. The craftsmanship was rough but careful, every groove and curve shaped with obvious effort. "Made it myself," Ethan said, his voice gruff. "I know it's not much. Can't afford gold or fancy stones, but I thought maybe something made by my own hands might mean something. Show that I'm serious about this. About us." Eliza reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the ring. It was warm from his hand, surprisingly light, and when she looked closely, she could see tiny imperfections in the wood, places where the knife had slipped slightly, where the grain hadn't quite cooperated. But those imperfections made it more beautiful, not less. They made it real. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Eliza Moore," Ethan said formally, dropping to one knee despite the protest of his still-healing leg. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Let me be a father to your children, build a life with me here on this land? I can't promise it'll be easy. Can't promise riches or comfort. But I can promise I'll work hard every day to provide for you and protect you, and be the kind of man you and your children deserve." Tears streamed down Eliza's face as she looked at this man kneeling before her, this rough, awkward, profoundly good man who had saved her family and then somehow become part of it. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. Yes, Ethan Cole, I'll marry you. I'll marry. He slipped the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her hand, and then he stood and pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he'd truly embraced her, and Eliza felt the strength in his body, the steadiness, the promise of safety and partnership. Behind them, a small voice squealed with delight. They broke apart to find all 11 children watching from various hiding spots, behind the corner of the house, peeking through windows, clustered near the barn. They'd been spying, clearly, waiting to see what would happen. "Did she say yes?" Sarah called out, her voice high with excitement. "She said yes," Ethan confirmed, and the children erupted in cheers. They came running then, all of them, surrounding Eliza and Ethan in a chaotic circle of hugs and questions and laughter. Even Matthew and John, trying to maintain their teenage dignity, couldn't hide their grins. Rebecca was crying happy tears, and the little ones were jumping up and down, not entirely sure what was happening but caught up in the joy of it. "Does this mean Mr. Cole will be our papa?" little Joseph asked, looking up at Ethan with wide, hopeful eyes. Ethan crouched down to the boy's level, his expression serious. "If you'll have me. I know I can't replace your real father, and I won't try to, but if you're willing, I'd be honored to be your papa from here on out." Joseph threw his small arms around Ethan's neck, and one by one the other children followed suit until Ethan was buried under a pile of embracing bodies. He looked overwhelmed and uncomfortable and happier than Eliza had ever seen him. They were married 2 weeks later in the small parlor of the territorial judge in Silver Creek. It wasn't the wedding Eliza had once dreamed of. There were no flowers or fancy dress, no crowd of well-wishers, no celebration. Just her and Ethan and the judge and the children as witnesses. Matthew stood as Ethan's best man, his young face solemn with the weight of the responsibility. Rebecca held the baby and tried to keep the younger ones quiet during the brief ceremony. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Ethan kissed Eliza chastely on the forehead, his ears turning red with embarrassment at the public display of affection. The children cheered anyway, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eliza felt something like pure, uncomplicated happiness. They spent that night as they'd spent so many others, Ethan by the fire, Eliza and the children in the loft and bedroom, because neither of them quite knew how to navigate this new reality. The practical arrangement they'd lived with for months didn't automatically transform just because vows had been spoken. But Eliza wore the wooden ring on her finger, and when she caught Ethan looking at her, she saw something new in his eyes. Not possession exactly, but belonging. They belonged to each other now, officially and completely. The real work of building a marriage began the next morning and continued through the long, hot summer. It wasn't easy. Ethan was set in his ways, accustomed to solitude and silence. Eliza had her own habits formed by years of managing alone. They bumped against each other awkwardly, learning to share space and decisions, learning to communicate about things that went beyond the practical matters of running a homestead. Their first real argument came in late July, over something so small Eliza could barely remember later what had started it. Something about how to manage the harvest, she thought, or whether to sell some of the produce in town. Whatever the cause, they'd both said sharp words, and Ethan had stalked off to the barn while Eliza had retreated to the house, her face hot with anger and embarrassment. Rebecca found her mother sitting at the table, staring at nothing. "You two will work it out," the girl said wisely, old beyond her 14 years. "How can you be sure?" Eliza asked. "Because you both want to," Rebecca replied simply. "That's what makes you different from other couples I've seen. You both actually want this to work. You're both willing to fight for it." She was right, of course. That evening, Ethan came back to the house and sat down across from Eliza at the table. "I was wrong," he said without preamble. "About the harvest? You were making sense, and I was just being stubborn because I'm used to deciding things on my own." "I was too quick to dismiss your concerns," Eliza admitted. "You know this land better than I do. I should have listened more carefully." They talked then, really talked, working through the disagreement until they reached a compromise that satisfied them both. And when they finished, Ethan reached across the table and took Eliza's hand, his thumb brushing over the wooden ring he'd made. "We're going to have more fights," he said. "Probably lots of them. We're both stubborn people." "Probably," Eliza agreed. "But we'll work through them," Ethan continued, "because that's what partners do. They don't run away when things get hard. They stand together and figure it out. Together, Eliza echoed, and the word felt like a promise. August brought a crisis that tested that promise to its core. A drought settled over the prairie day after day of relentless sun and cloudless sky. The crops began to wither. The creek that supplied their water dropped to a trickle. The animals grew restless and irritable in the heat. Ethan worked himself nearly to exhaustion trying to save what he could, hauling water from the deeper well, building shade structures, doing everything possible to minimize the damage. Matthew and John helped, their young faces grim with worry. Everyone knew how much they depended on the harvest. It would determine whether they had enough to eat through the next winter, whether they could afford supplies and necessities. One particularly brutal afternoon, Eliza found Ethan sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Lost half the wheat," he said without looking up. "Maybe more. And the vegetable garden's barely producing. I don't know if we'll have enough." "We'll have enough," Eliza said firmly. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," she insisted, "because even if the harvest fails completely, we'll figure something out. We'll hunt. We'll fish. We'll make do with less. We've survived worse than a drought, Ethan. We'll survive this too." He finally looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed from sun and dust and worry. "I promise to provide for you, to take care of you and the children. What kind of husband can't even—" "The kind who's doing everything humanly possible," Eliza interrupted. "The kind who works until his hands bleed trying to save the crops. The kind who cares so much about his family's welfare that he's tearing himself apart with worry. That's the kind of husband you are, Ethan, and that's exactly the kind I need." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "We're not going to starve. We're not going to freeze. We're going to make it through this together, just like we've made it through everything else. Do you understand me?" Something in his expression cracked, and he pulled her into a tight embrace, his face buried against her shoulder. She held him, while his body shook with silent sobs. All the fear and frustration and overwhelming responsibility he'd been carrying finally breaking through his stoic exterior. "I've got you," Eliza murmured against his hair. "We've got each other. That's what matters most." The drought broke in early September with storms that rolled across the prairie like artillery fire. Rain came in sheets, drenching the parched earth, filling the creek until it overflowed its banks. Too late to save most of the wheat, but the garden recovered, and the late-season vegetables thrived in the renewed moisture. They wouldn't have the harvest Ethan had hoped for, but they'd have enough. Barely enough. But enough. "We're going to need to be careful this winter," Ethan told the family one evening at supper. "Watch every penny, make every resource stretch. It's going to be tight." "We can do tight," Matthew said confidently. "We've done tight before." "And we always had less then than we have now," Rebecca added. "We've got the chickens for eggs, the cow for milk, a full root cellar. We've got each other. That's more than enough." Looking around the table at the children's determined faces, at Eliza's steady confidence, Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. They weren't afraid. They were ready to face hardship together, to work and sacrifice and support each other through whatever came. This was what family meant, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of unity in facing it. "You're right," he said quietly. "We'll be fine." And they were. The winter that followed was lean but not desperate. They rationed carefully, hunted when they could, made every resource count. The children never complained, even when meals were simple and portions small. They'd learned something over the past year, learned that security didn't come from abundance, but from knowing they could rely on each other no matter what. Christmas that year was nothing like the lonely holiday Ethan had spent the year before. The house was full of noise and laughter, of children singing carols and playing games they'd invented with sticks and stones. Eliza had saved back a bit of sugar and made simple cookies that the children savored like treasures. Ethan carved small wooden toys for the younger ones, working in secret in the barn for weeks. When the children were finally asleep on Christmas night, exhausted from excitement, Eliza and Ethan sat together by the fire. She'd moved her sleeping space down from the loft after the wedding, and though they still maintained a certain awkward distance, they'd grown more comfortable with each other's presence. "Thank you," Eliza said softly. "For what?" "For giving my children a real Christmas, for making them feel safe, and loved and like they belong somewhere. They do belong, Ethan said. This is their home. Our home. Eliza reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I love you, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I know we haven't talked about that much, and I know our marriage started as more of a practical arrangement, but I need you to know I love you, Ethan Cole. Not out of gratitude or obligation, but because of who you are, because of how you love my children, because of how you've shown me what real partnership looks like. Ethan stared at their joined hands for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I love you too. Have for a while now, actually. Just didn't know how to say it. Didn't know if you'd want to hear it. I want to hear it, Eliza whispered. Every day. If you're willing. He pulled her closer, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the prairie in white. But inside the small house, warmth and love pushed back against the cold. Spring came again, as it always did, and with it came new challenges and new joys. The garden was planted larger than ever, with all the children helping. The fields were sown with hope for a better harvest. The animals multiplied, adding to their modest prosperity. One warm April morning, Eliza realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first she dismissed it as stress or age. She was past 35 after all. But when it happened again, and then a third time, she couldn't deny the truth. She was pregnant. The realization terrified her. 12 children. She would have 12 children. At her age, with all the risks that came with pregnancy and childbirth, with another mouth to feed when resources were already stretched thin. But beneath the fear was something else. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at the thought of bringing Ethan's child into the world, of giving him this gift after he'd given her family so much. She told him one evening as they worked together in the barn, her words tumbling out nervously. Ethan went completely still, his hands freezing on the leather tack he'd been oiling. A baby, he repeated, as if testing the words. Our baby. Yes, Eliza said. I know it's not ideal timing, and I know we're already stretched thin, and I know... She stopped because Ethan had dropped the tack and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle. When he set her down, his face was split by the widest smile she'd ever seen from him. A baby, he said again, and this time his voice was filled with wonder. Our baby, Eliza, this is everything I never thought I'd have. You're not worried? She asked, searching his face. About the cost, the work, I'm terrified, Ethan admitted honestly. But I'm also happier than I've ever been. We'll figure it out, just like we figure everything else out. Together. The children were equally thrilled when they learned the news. Even the older ones, who understood the practical implications, couldn't contain their excitement at having a new sibling. Rebecca immediately started planning, talking about how she'd help with the baby, how the little ones could take turns holding it, how they'd all pitch in to make things easier for Eliza. We're going to need a bigger house, Matthew observed practically. Eventually, anyway. This one's already pretty crowded. Then we'll build one, Ethan said simply. Next summer, after the harvest. We'll add on, make more room, make this place fit the family it's holding. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged out loud that this wasn't temporary, wasn't a stopgap measure until something better came along. This was permanent, this was home, and they were going to invest in it, build it up, make it a place that could hold all of them comfortably. The baby came in early December during a cold snap that froze the prairie solid. The birth was hard, harder than any of Eliza's previous labors. And for several terrifying hours, Ethan paced the small house while the midwife from Silver Creek worked behind the closed bedroom door. When he finally heard the baby's cry, thin and reedy but unmistakably alive, Ethan's legs nearly gave out from relief. The midwife emerged a few minutes later, her face tired but smiling. You have a daughter, she announced, and your wife is fine. Exhausted, but fine. Ethan went into the bedroom to find Eliza propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle, red-faced and squalling. Our daughter, Eliza said softly, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. Our hope. Hope, Ethan repeated, moving closer to look at the impossibly small person they'd created together. That's perfect. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Eliza placed the baby in his arms. Hope quieted immediately, her unfocused eyes trying to make sense of this new world, her tiny hand curling around Ethan's finger with surprising strength. She's beautiful, Ethan whispered, his voice thick. Perfect. The other children were allowed in one at a time to meet their new sister. The younger ones were awed into silence, their eyes huge as they took in the miracle of new life. The older ones were more composed, but no less moved. Rebecca cried openly, and Matthew's voice cracked when he congratulated his mother. That night, with Eliza and Hope resting in the bedroom, and the children settled in their various sleeping spots, Ethan stood at the window and looked out at the frozen prairie. 2 years ago, he'd been alone in this house, going through the motions of living without really being alive. He'd been haunted by his sister's death, convinced that he'd failed in the most fundamental way possible. Now his house was full of children, 12 of them, counting the baby. His wife slept peacefully in the next room, recovering from bringing their daughter into the world. His stepsons had become the sons of his heart, working beside him every day, learning and growing. His stepdaughters had brought warmth and care and gentleness to a house that had known only harsh practicality. He hadn't failed. His sister's death would always be a sorrow, but he'd honored her memory in the best way possible, by making sure other children didn't suffer the same fate. By opening his home and his heart to a family that needed him just as desperately as he'd needed them. The first real test of their expanded family came that spring when Mrs. Ashford returned, this time with the territorial marshal in tow. Eliza saw them coming and immediately sent the children to the barn with Rebecca in charge, her heart hammering with fear. Ethan met them in the yard, his stance wide and defensive. Eliza stood beside him, Hope bundled against her chest, presenting a united front. Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole, Mrs. Ashford said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I've brought Marshal Thompson to investigate the welfare of the children living on this property. The children are fine, Ethan said flatly. Nevertheless, the marshal needs to see for himself, Mrs. Ashford insisted. There have been concerns raised about the suitability of this arrangement, particularly given the number of minors involved. The marshal, a weathered man in his 50s, looked uncomfortable with his assignment. Mr. Cole, I don't want any trouble. I just need to verify that the children are being properly cared for. If you'll allow me to speak with them and inspect the premises, inspect whatever you want, Ethan interrupted. Talk to whomever you want. We've got nothing to hide. What followed was the most thorough examination Eliza had ever endured. The marshal walked through the house, noting the sleeping arrangements, the food stores, the general cleanliness. He spoke to each child individually, asking about their treatment, their education, their daily life. He examined their clothes, their health, even their hands to see if they bore signs of abuse or neglect. Throughout it all, Mrs. Ashford hovered disapprovingly, clearly expecting to find evidence of mistreatment, but there was none to find. The children were healthy, well-fed, and obviously happy. The house was clean and orderly. The property was well-maintained. When the marshal finished his inspection, even Mrs. Ashford's pursed lips couldn't hide the fact that she'd found no ammunition for her crusade. Well, Marshal, she demanded, surely you can see that this situation is irregular. All these children living in such close quarters. What I see, the marshal interrupted, his tone firm, is a family. A large family, certainly, but a functional one. The children are cared for, educated according to their abilities, and clearly loved. Mr. and Mrs. Cole are legally married, making this arrangement entirely proper. I see no grounds for intervention. But, Mrs. Ashford, the marshal said, turning to face her directly, I understand your concerns and I appreciate your dedication to children's welfare. But sometimes the best place for children is exactly where they are. These children have a home, 2 parents who provide for them, and each other for support. That's more than many children have. I suggest we leave this family in peace. Mrs. Ashford sputtered with indignation, but the marshal was already mounting his horse. He tipped his hat to Eliza and Ethan. You folks have a good day, and congratulations on the new baby. As they rode away, Eliza felt Ethan's arm come around her shoulders, solid and reassuring. The children emerged from the barn, their faces anxious. And when they saw their parents still standing together, relief washed over them. "Are they gone?" Matthew called out. "They're gone," Ethan confirmed. "Ethan, for good, I think." That night, after the children were asleep and Hope was settled in her cradle beside their bed, Eliza and Ethan lay in the darkness talking quietly. "Do you think she'll come back?" Eliza asked. "No," Ethan said confidently. "The marshal made his ruling. She'd look foolish trying to overturn it without new evidence, and there won't be any new evidence because we're doing right by these children." "Our children," Eliza corrected softly. "Our children," Ethan agreed. "Every one of them." Summer arrived with abundant rain and moderate temperatures, perfect growing weather. The crops thrived, and by harvest time it was clear they'd have more than enough to get through the winter with plenty to spare. Ethan allowed himself to hope that maybe, finally, they'd turned a corner from mere survival to something approaching prosperity. True to his word, he began working on expanding the house. Matthew and John helped, along with two neighboring homesteaders who'd proven themselves friendly despite the general social ostracism the Coles faced. The addition would include a proper bedroom for Eliza and Ethan, a larger space for the girls, and a loft area for the boys that would give them more room to grow. Watching the house take shape, Eliza felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was more than just adding square footage. This was a statement of permanence, a declaration that they were here to stay, that this family was real and lasting. One afternoon in late August, as the framework of the addition went up, a wagon approached from the direction of Silver Creek. Eliza tensed automatically, but relaxed when she recognized the driver, Mr. Peters, who ran the general store. He climbed down from the wagon with a friendly smile. "Mrs. Cole." "Mr. Cole. Thought I'd stop by on my way back from deliveries." "Mr. Peters," Ethan greeted him warily. "What can we do for you?" "Actually, I came to ask what you might do for me," Mr. Peters said. "I've been hearing about the produce from your garden. Best in the territory, people say. I was wondering if you might have extra to sell. I've got customers asking for fresh vegetables, and I'd pay fair prices." Eliza and Ethan exchanged glances. This was the first time anyone from town had approached them with a business proposition, the first acknowledgement that they might have something valuable to offer beyond scandal and gossip. "We might have some extra," Eliza said carefully. "Rebecca and I have been preserving everything we can, but there's probably surplus we could sell." "Excellent," Mr. Peters beamed. "And I heard your older boys are handy with woodworking. I don't suppose they'd be interested in making some items for the store. Simple things, spoons, bowls, that sort of thing. There's always demand for well-made goods." "We could do that," Matthew said eagerly, stepping forward. "Mr. Cole's been teaching us." What started as a simple business arrangement grew into something more. Mr. Peters proved to be a fair dealer, and word spread about the quality of the Coles' produce and handcrafted items. Other merchants began approaching them. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to accept that the Cole family wasn't going anywhere, and that they might as well do business with them. It wasn't friendship exactly. Most people still kept their distance, still whispered about the widow who'd trapped the bachelor into taking on her massive brood. But it was a form of acceptance, a recognition that the Coles had earned their place through hard work and determination. By the time Hope celebrated her first birthday, the expanded house was complete and the family's prospects had improved dramatically. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they were stable in a way that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. On Hope's birthday, they gathered around the table for a simple celebration. Eliza had made a small cake with precious sugar, and the children sang while Hope clapped her hands and laughed, looking around at her family, at Ethan's proud smile, at the children's happy faces, at the home they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. Eliza felt a peace she'd never thought she'd know again. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked quietly, reaching over to take her hand. "I'm thinking about the night we arrived," Eliza said, "how desperate we were, how certain I was that we wouldn't survive. And now? Now I know that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes," Eliza said. "We lost everything, but we found this. Found you. Found home." Ethan squeezed her hand, his wooden ring, he'd carved one for himself to match hers, pressing against her fingers. "Best thing that ever happened to me was opening that barn door and finding you there. Best thing that happened to me was you letting us stay, Eliza countered. We're staying forever, right, Mama? Little Sarah asked, having overheard their conversation. Forever, Eliza confirmed, looking at Ethan. This is our home now. Our forever home. Forever, Ethan agreed, and in his eyes Eliza saw the truth of it. They'd been tested by weather and poverty and social censure. They'd faced down those who wanted to tear them apart. They'd survived drought and injury and the simple, grinding work of building a life from scratch. And they'd done it together. The years that followed brought more challenges. There were always challenges, but also more joys. Matthew grew into a man, eventually claiming his own piece of land adjacent to Ethan's and building a house there with his father's help. John followed a few years later. Rebecca married a good man who saw past her humble beginnings to the remarkable woman she'd become. The other children grew and thrived, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the family that had saved them. Eliza and Ethan had 3 more children together, each one welcomed with the same joy as Hope had been. The house expanded again to accommodate everyone, growing organically to fit the family it sheltered. People sometimes asked Ethan if he ever regretted opening his barn that night, letting in a widow and her 11 children who'd upended his entire life. His answer was always the same. Regret? He'd say, looking genuinely confused by the question. Why would I regret finding my family? Because that's what they were. Not a burden accepted out of obligation or guilt, not charity given to the desperate, not a practical arrangement born of mutual need, though it had started that way. They were family, chosen deliberately, built intentionally, sustained through love and work, and unwavering commitment to each other. Eliza Moore had been driven from town as a burden, chased away with her children like animals. She'd arrived at Ethan Cole's barn with nothing but desperation and fear, but she'd found something there in the hay, something she hadn't expected. She'd found a man willing to see past numbers and inconvenience to the people underneath. She'd found someone willing to claim her family as his own, to stand against judgment and criticism, to build a life based not on what society expected, but on what his heart demanded. She'd found home, and in the end, that was everything that mattered, not the size of the house, or the abundance of the harvest, or the approval of neighbors. Just the simple, profound truth that they belonged to each other, and that belonging was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.